They said I walked slower than a corpse. Imagine hearing that from your own grandson, a boy whose first steps I once held with trembling hands, whose cries I once soothed with songs, whose scraped knees I once bent down to bandage before he even knew what pain meant. He said it not with the innocence of a child repeating a phrase he didn't understand, but with a smirk, a practiced cruelty he had already absorbed from the air around him, the kind of remark that doesn't arrive from nowhere, but grows in the soil of a household where ridicule is fertilizer. He said it over breakfast, spoon dangling from his mouth, cereal crunching between his teeth, as though I were less substantial than the milk dripping from his lips. And in that moment, I felt something familiar rise in me. Not the sting of the words themselves, I have endured worse, but the sharp realization that invisibility and contempt, once they settle into a family, pass down faster than heirlooms. I am 82 years old now, and I live alone in a small rented flat with thin walls and a view of a parking lot that never empties. There are no family portraits on my dresser, no echoes of children running down the hall. This is not the home where I raised my son, the home with wallpaper I glued with my own hands and curtains I sewed while he napped in his crib, the home that once smelled of bread baking on Saturdays and lemon polish on Sundays. That house was taken from me 2 years ago, with papers slid across a kitchen table and phrases like estate planning and future security spoken in voices that pretended to care but only wanted efficiency. They said it was to protect me, to simplify things, to ensure that no matter what happened, I would be safe. Safe from what? From living in the house I bought with my husband's life insurance after the cancer hollowed him out. From the one place where every corner carried memory like dust in the air. Safe from the joy of choosing where I sat, what I touched, which window I opened in the morning. They signed my name onto lines that seemed harmless, but I didn't yet know that signatures can be cages, and cages can be painted in pastel colors so they don't look like prisons at all. Since then, my world has shrunk into these four walls, into routines small enough to keep me quiet, into errands that never stretch far beyond the nearest grocery store, into days where I don't speak until the cashier asks if I want a receipt. Sometimes I tell myself I prefer it this way, that solitude is a balm rather than a wound, that silence is chosen and not imposed. But then the phone rings, not with warmth, but with reminders. My son asking if I remembered to pay the utility bill, though the money is no longer mine. My daughter-in-law's clipped voice instructing me not to send sweets for the children because they're trying a sugar-free month. My grandson's sudden laugh when he hears me mix up the name of a cartoon character. And all of it builds like sediment until one morning at the breakfast table, out of nowhere, the boy I once carried in my arms turned to me with that phrase, delivered as casually as a weather report. You walk slower than a corpse. The room smelled of burnt toast and disinfectant wipes, a smell I've grown to associate with their kitchen, sterile and sharp, not like the kitchens I once knew where spills were forgiven and sugar left its dust across counters. His father didn't correct him. His mother didn't glance up. They let the words fall and stay, as though they agreed, as though I had become the family joke, the punchline in a house that only laughs when someone else shrinks. And I, in that moment, did not cry or plead or lecture. I leaned toward him, my hand steady on the table, and whispered so softly that only he could hear. Yet I still outran every disappointment your father ever became. His eyes widened, and for a second he looked like a child again, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. His father cleared his throat but said nothing, perhaps too stunned, perhaps too ashamed, or perhaps just too used to letting things slip into silence. I didn't stay much longer that morning. I excused myself, left my half-drunk tea on the table, and stepped out into the brittle sunlight. My steps were slow, yes, slower than the girl I once was, slower than the woman who once ran through rain to catch a bus to work, slower than the mother who once carried groceries in both arms with a child tugging at her skirt. But each step was still mine. Each step still carried the weight of all I had endured, all I had given, all I had lost. And that is what they will never understand. That slowness is not weakness. That slowness is sometimes the residue of having lived long enough to carry stories too heavy for speed. So here I am, 82, sitting at my small table by the window, speaking these words to no one and to everyone. I am not the corpse they tried to paint me as. I am the woman who buried her husband, who paid the mortgage twice when her son lost his job, who raised grandchildren in summers so their parents could travel, who still keeps recipes folded in envelopes, who knows the smell of betrayal as clearly as she knows the smell of lavender soap. I am slower, yes, but not because I am dying. I am slower because I am choosing each step carefully now, choosing not to rush back into the arms of those who mock me, choosing not to be hurried into a silence that benefits only them. They think I am finished. They think I am too small to fight, too tired to resist, too bound by love to walk away. But they do not yet know what a woman discovers when she has been dismissed one too many times. They do not yet know what it means when someone whispers back instead of swallowing her words. They do not yet know that the corpse they imagine still breathes, still remembers, still carries keys they never thought she would keep. The true betrayal did not happen at that breakfast table, although the sting of those words still clings to me, like smoke on old curtains. It happened 2 years earlier, on an afternoon when I thought I was being included, when I believed foolishly that my son wanted my voice, my wisdom, my blessing, when in fact all he wanted was my signature. The day was gray, the kind of gray that makes you feel as though time itself has stopped, and I had been invited to his house under the pretense of lunch, something warm and simple, he said, a chance to sit together without fuss. I should have noticed the way his wife hovered in the doorway of the kitchen, not really looking at me, her smile brittle, her phone clutched like a lifeline. I should have paid attention to the way he cleared space on the dining table before we even ate, stacking papers neatly, a folder the color of sand, a pen placed on top as if waiting for me. But I was too grateful in that moment to be there at all, too relieved to be asked, too desperate to feel like a mother who was still necessary. He spoke with that soothing tone children sometimes use when they want to manage you, a sing-song patience that hides impatience underneath. He told me that as I was getting older, it would be wise to think about the future, about what would happen if I fell ill, if I lost memory, if I could not keep up with bills or repairs. And as he spoke, I nodded like a schoolgirl, ashamed of the idea of decline, ashamed of being a burden, already shrinking beneath the weight of his careful phrasing. He told me that transferring the deed of my house to him would not change anything, that it was only paperwork, a shield against taxes, a way to protect me if anything went wrong, that I would still live there, still choose my furniture, still open my own windows, still be queen of the little castle I had built with my husband's absence and my own stubborn savings. I wanted to believe him because it was easier than doubting, easier than fighting, easier than letting suspicion poison the rare days when I was welcomed into his orbit. I signed. I signed because I was tired, because the food was cooling on the stove, and I didn't want to ruin the mood, because his wife was watching with that look that said this was already decided, because he smiled at me the way he hadn't smiled in years, as though we were a team again, as though I was important. My hand shook a little as I wrote my name, but I told myself it was only the arthritis. Later, when they poured wine into glasses and clinked them together, when they told me I had done something wise, something responsible, I let myself feel a flicker of pride, a flicker of relief, as though I had indeed secured my own future. That flicker carried me for weeks, until the day a letter arrived in the mail, addressed still to me, a notice from the bank about a loan I had never taken, a mortgage I had never agreed to, lines of numbers that made no sense until I remembered the folder, the pen, the smile, the promises. My son had borrowed against the house, against the roof I had built over both our heads, against the last solid thing in my life, and he had done it without telling me, without asking, without even offering an excuse. I confronted him, trembling with fury that felt alien in my own body, my heart pounding in a way that scared me, but he only shrugged, only told me it was complicated, that money was tight, that the loan was temporary, that I didn't understand how. Things worked now. He said it as if I were a child, as if I hadn't worked double shifts to pay off the first mortgage, as if I hadn't budgeted pennies to keep the lights on, as if I hadn't learned arithmetic in the hardest way, by deciding which bill to pay late so my son could have a new pair of shoes. When I tried to press him, his voice hardened, sharp edges hidden no longer, and he said, "You should be grateful. You don't need to worry about these things anymore. We're taking care of you. Taking care." That phrase, which once meant tenderness, which once meant protection, now sounded like a lock clicking shut. Within months, I was moved out of that house, the house with the garden where I had planted marigolds each spring, the house where the floorboards still held the echoes of my husband's coughs in his final year, the house where the attic smelled of old, school projects and forgotten Christmas ornaments. They called it downsizing, said it would be easier for me to manage a rental, that I wouldn't have to climb stairs, that I wouldn't have to shovel snow, that I wouldn't have to deal with maintenance, as though I hadn't handled those very things for decades. They found me a small flat at the edge of town, close enough that they could claim they were looking after me, but far enough that I could not walk to familiar places. Far enough that every time I opened the curtains, I saw only strangers' cars and cracked asphalt. My belongings were thinned without my consent, boxes disappearing into donation bins, furniture sold under the word unnecessary, photo frames packed away so quickly that I feared some would never reappear. The betrayal was not only in the loss of bricks and wood, but in the erasure of memory, the quiet dismantling of a life built in layers. When I asked about the old oak wardrobe my husband had restored with his own hands, my son said it was too heavy for the movers, as though the weight of memory was an inconvenience. When I searched for the quilt my mother had sewn, my daughter-in-law told me it had been misplaced, her tone too casual, too practiced. Each absence was a small theft, each omission a reminder that my place in their lives was shrinking, that I was being folded into the margins, not erased entirely. Oh no, they still wanted me for appearances, for babysitting, for the occasional family. Dinner where I was presented like an antique, but no longer central, no longer rooted, no longer essential. That was the true catalyst, the moment when I realized I had been tricked not with cruelty, but with kindness sharpened into a blade. They did not yell. They did not throw me out onto the street. They did not curse my name. They simply smiled, patted my arm, and told me it was better this way. And for a long while, I tried to swallow that story, to wear it like a dress that didn't fit, too tight around the ribs, too short at the hem. I told myself I had agreed, that I had chosen this, that it was not theft but transition. But then came the morning at breakfast when my grandson looked at me with those eyes that mirrored his father's, when he let that phrase fall so casually, slower than a corpse, and in that moment, everything came back: the folder, the pen, the papers, the signature, the loan, the move, the quilt gone, the wardrobe discarded, the house emptied. And I knew then, without doubt, that the betrayal had not been a single act but a chain, each link forged by my silence, each link polished by their indifference, until finally it bound me into the image they wanted: the grateful, diminished, obedient old woman who should not expect more than a chair in the corner and a plate set out of habit. I was not that woman. I never was. I had signed, yes, but signatures can be undone, papers can be challenged, and silence can be broken. The catalyst was not the ink that dried on the page that afternoon. It was the moment I realized that I had been written out of my own story, and that the only way back in was to pick up the pen again, this time not to give away, but to reclaim. It is a strange thing how cruelty rarely arrives with fanfare, how it does not announce itself in storms or shouts, but seeps into a room like a draft you cannot find the source of, chilling you little by little until you realize your bones ache. After the papers were signed and the house was gone, life did not collapse in a single dramatic gesture. There were no suitcases on the lawn, no slammed doors, no final speeches, only a quiet reordering of how things were done, of where I stood, of when I was spoken to and when I was ignored. And it was in that quiet that I felt myself being erased piece by piece. The flat they moved me into was smaller than the pantry in my old house felt, though it had 2 rooms, a kitchen barely large enough for a chair, and windows that looked onto a parking lot where cars came and went, but people never lingered. They told me I would like it, that it was cozy, easier to clean, closer to amenities, and I smiled politely, because that is what you do. When your life has already been packed into boxes, you did not seal yourself. When your possessions are reduced to a fraction, and your questions are brushed away with gentle irritation. My son said, "It's better this way, Mom. You won't have to worry." And those words, better and worry, repeated themselves like gnats around my head at night, reminding me that what he really meant was, it is better for us, and your worries are inconvenient to our comfort. At first I tried to settle. I bought a plant for the windowsill, a small green thing that promised to grow if only I remembered to water it. But it withered within weeks because the light in that place was weak, the kind of light that filters through dirty glass and makes everything look like it has already been forgotten. I placed my husband's photograph on the dresser, his eyes looking out from the frame with the same amused patience he had worn when he fixed the kitchen sink with nothing but string and stubbornness. And for a while, I could almost pretend that he was reminding me to hold my ground. But each time I visited my son's house, each time I crossed the threshold into their spotless kitchen and watched my grandson scrolling on his phone without looking up, I felt myself shrinking further, like fabric left too long in water, losing shape, losing strength. The first signs of diminishment were subtle. The way they spoke over me at the dinner table, finishing my sentences with tidier endings than I had intended. The way my daughter-in-law began to introduce me to her friends, not as Mary, not as Mom, not as Grandma, but as our family's elder, a title that sounded less like belonging and more like a relic kept for display. When I offered to bring a dish, she would laugh lightly and say, "Oh no, we've got it covered," as if my cooking, the very cooking that had once kept them alive, was now a liability, a risk, an intrusion into their curated meals of kale salads and salmon fillets arranged like magazine covers. Then came the silences, the phone calls not returned, the messages answered days later with curt lines, the invitations that ceased without explanation. Birthdays that used to be family affairs were suddenly quiet this year. Holidays trimmed down until I was told to stay home and rest, as though celebration itself might strain me. My role became that of the occasional babysitter, summoned only when convenience demanded it, thanked with words that sounded practiced, hollow, as though gratitude had become a chore. My grandson began to mimic the tone of his parents, not openly hostile, but carelessly dismissive, and though I knew he was only a child, still learning where cruelty comes from, each small jab felt like a rehearsal for the man he would one day become. If no one stopped him, the mornings in the flat were the hardest, when the silence stretched too wide, and I could hear the hum of my neighbor's television through the thin walls, voices laughing at sitcom jokes I could not see, reminding me that life was happening elsewhere, always elsewhere, never where I was. I would sit with my tea, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth, and remember the mornings in my old house when sunlight fell across the kitchen table in golden stripes, when I could hear birds in the garden and smell the damp earth of freshly watered marigolds. In this new place, the only sound was the garbage truck rattling by at dawn, and the smell was not flowers, but exhaust and damp concrete. Every visit to their house became another notch in the slow erosion of my place in the family. Once, I brought a tin of cookies, the same recipe I had baked since my son was small, the kind he used to devour warm from the oven, and my daughter-in-law accepted them with a thin smile before placing them on the highest shelf of the pantry. Untouched, forgotten. Later, I saw them in the trash, uneaten, the tin bent as though someone had stepped on it, and though no one said a word, the message was clear enough. Another time, I tried to tell a story about my childhood, about the winters when ice crept through the windows and we slept under 3 blankets, about the way my mother sewed patches on our clothes until the patches outnumbered the fabric, and halfway through my grandson interrupted to say, "Why do you always talk about the past?" Nobody cares about that old stuff, and the room fell quiet except for the clink of forks against plates. No one corrected him. The diminishment was not in any single word or act, but in the accumulation of them, the way small dismissals stack until they become a wall you cannot see over. Each laugh at my expense, each roll of the eyes, each sigh when I asked a question became another brick. Soon I learned to speak less, to offer less, to sit quietly in the corner while conversations flowed around me, and in my silence they seemed relieved, as though my invisibility made the air easier to breathe. That relief, more than any insult, was what cut deepest, the realization that my absence was easier for them than my presence, that I had become not a person to them, but an obstacle to be managed, a shadow to be ignored until it faded completely. And yet, even as I shrank, something inside me resisted, a small ember that refused to go out. Each time I walked back to the flat after one of those visits, each time I unlocked the door and stepped into the stale air, I would place my handbag on the table and sit with my husband's photograph, staring into his eyes, and I could almost hear his voice saying, "Don't let them write you out." That ember glowed faintly, enough to remind me that I was not wrong, that this slow exclusion was not my fault, that the erasure I felt was deliberate and cruel, no matter how politely it was dressed. It was during one of those mornings, after a night of restless sleep, after a dream of walking through my old garden only to find the soil turned to ash, that I resolved I would not let the silence win. I did not yet know what action I would take. I did not yet see the path forward, but I began to gather the scraps of my life that still belonged to me. The old letters, the deed copy I had kept hidden, the notes scribbled in my late husband's handwriting, as though by holding them I could remember who I had been before signatures and smiles had diminished me. The ember warmed, small but steady, and though the days continued with their routines of dismissal, though the walls of the flat still pressed in, I knew I was not done. I was slower, yes, slower than I once was, but not still, not silent, not gone. The shift did not arrive like thunder, not as a sudden revelation that cracked open the sky, but as something quieter, the way dawn creeps into a room, even through a torn curtain, insisting on light where you thought there was only night. After weeks of moving through days that felt like repetitions of the same small humiliation, I found myself one morning sitting with a stack of papers I had tucked into the bottom drawer of my dresser. Papers I had avoided because looking at them meant remembering the day I had signed away what was mine. My hands shook as I opened the folder, not from age, though I told myself it was arthritis, but from the weight of what I was about to face. There, among the bank statements and utility bills, was a copy of the original deed, my name still printed in bold letters, not yet erased in ink, though erased in practice, a reminder that once, not so long ago, I had been the rightful owner of something more than these walls with peeling paint. I stared at the document until the letters blurred, and I thought of the afternoon when my son slid those papers across the table, his voice sweet as honey and just as sticky, and I realized that the betrayal had not only been his, but mine too, because I had let myself believe that surrender was safety. I closed the folder, pressed it against my chest, and for the first time in months, I felt not grief, but anger, a clean anger that did not scatter me, but gathered me, pulled me upright, steadied my spine. That anger whispered that I could still act, that signatures can be challenged, that silence is only permanent if you agree to it. The very next day, I began to walk. Not the kind of walk meant for exercise, not the shuffling circles of a woman trying to keep her joints alive, but deliberate walks into town, each step a claim that the world was still mine to move through. My legs ached, my hips protested, my breath caught in my throat, but I walked anyway, slower than most, yes, but steady. And as I moved past shop windows and bus stops and strangers carrying bags, I began to feel something I had forgotten, the sense that I was not invisible. People nodded, a cashier smiled, a child dropped a toy, and I bent to pick it up. And in that simple exchange, I felt more alive than in all the dinners where I had sat silent in my son's home. It was on one of those walks that I found myself standing in front of the library, a building I had not entered in years, its bricks worn but proud, its windows reflecting a sky that seemed wider than I remembered. Inside, it smelled of paper and dust and something else, something like possibility, and as I wandered through the aisles, my fingers grazing the spines of books, I came across a shelf of pamphlets on housing rights, elder care, guardianship abuse. I picked one up, then another, my hands trembling not with weakness, but with urgency. And I sat at a table with a stack so high I felt like a student again, hunched over, reading line after line, words that spoke of coercion, undue influence, reversals of transfers. My pulse quickened as I realized that what had happened to me was not fate, not inevitability, but a pattern others had named, fought, sometimes even overturned. That afternoon I stayed until the library closed, copying phone numbers, writing down case references, filling a notebook with questions I had been too ashamed to ask. As I gathered my things, a young woman with a streak of silver in her hair and a tattoo that snaked up her wrist stopped me, her voice warm, asking if I needed help. I hesitated, then showed her the pamphlets, expecting a polite nod before she returned to her own work. But instead, she pulled out the chair across from me and said, "I used to be a lawyer. I know this system. If you want, I can explain." I almost cried. Not because she was offering knowledge, but because she was offering it without judgment, without the condescension I had grown so used to. Her name was Claire, and over the next hour, she sketched out possibilities, paths, steps I could take, her voice calm, her eyes steady. And though I knew the road would not be simple, I felt for the first time that it might be possible. When I returned home that evening, the flat did not seem quite as small, the walls not quite as close. I boiled water for tea, set out my husband's photograph, and told him aloud what I had done, how I had walked, how I had read, how I had spoken with someone who believed me. And though, of course, no voice answered, I felt a kind of reply in myself, as though I had cracked open a window I had not touched in years, letting in air that was both sharp and sweet. I took out the deed copy again, laid it on the table, and for the first time, I did not feel defeated when I looked at it. Instead, I felt as though I were looking at a map, a reminder of where I had been, and a hint of where I could go. The days that followed were still filled with silence, still marked by my son's absence, my grandson's mockery, my daughter-in-law's clipped tone. But inside me, something had shifted. When the phone rang with one of their curt reminders, I no longer trembled. When I was told what not to do, what not to eat, where not to go, I listened but did not obey, at least not in my heart. I had begun to plan, to gather, to imagine, and that imagining was enough to carry me through the nights when doubt returned like an unwelcome guest. I knew I was not yet free, not yet safe, not yet restored, but I also knew I was no longer passive, no longer the woman who sat quietly while others decided her fate. The midpoint of my story was not a grand gesture, not a courtroom victory or a slammed door, but the simple act of standing up, walking out, opening a library door, picking up a pamphlet, and daring to believe that my life was not yet finished. It was the shift from silence to questions, from shame to anger, from stillness to movement. It was the moment I remembered that survival is not enough, that dignity is not granted by others, but reclaimed by oneself. I was still slow, still tired, still surrounded by people who underestimated me, but I had begun to move in a different direction, and even the slowest movement can change the course of a life. When you begin to move, even slowly, even quietly, the world has a way of noticing. It does not matter if the steps are tentative or if your hands shake when you reach for the handle of a door you once thought closed forever. Once you open it, once you breathe differently, once you stop obeying the silence, someone always notices. For months, I had lived as though unseen, dismissed as decoration, ignored as an inconvenience. And then, when I began to gather papers, to walk further than the grocery store, to ask questions in places they never expected me to ask them, suddenly I was visible again, but not in the way I wanted. My son discovered me, not with the pride of a man realizing his mother was still alive in spirit, but with the suspicion of someone sensing a threat to the little kingdom he had built from my bones. It began with a phone call. His voice was clipped, tighter than usual, the way he spoke when business was not going well, that tone that left no space for reply. "Mom," he said, "why are you asking questions at the library?" At first I was stunned that he knew, that the walls of this town carried whispers faster than I could walk, that someone had mentioned seeing me with pamphlets, maybe the librarian, maybe even Claire, though I doubted her. She had looked at me with solidarity, not betrayal. I answered slowly, saying only that I was curious, that I wanted to understand what had happened, but he cut me off, sharp as a knife. You don't need to understand. That's what I'm here for. That's why we took care of the house, why we handled the paperwork. You don't have to worry about those things anymore. Worry. That word again, that false comfort sharpened into a leash. I said nothing, and my silence must have unsettled him, because his voice grew harder, lower, carrying an edge I had not heard since he was a teenager slamming doors. Don't stir things up, Mom. It doesn't help anyone. It only makes things harder for us. For me, for him. Always for him. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the years I had balanced bills so he could stay in college. If he remembered the nights I had walked to work in the rain so he would not have to wear secondhand shoes. If he remembered the loans I had signed when his business was failing the first time. But I knew he remembered, and I also knew memory meant nothing to him now, not when it clashed with the story he had built, that he was the provider, the caretaker, the one in control. The next week he came to the flat in person, unannounced, his knock heavy on the door as though he were already angry. When I opened it, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the papers on the table, the notebook filled with notes, the pamphlets from the library. He picked one up without asking and read a line aloud, his voice mocking, "Elder financial exploitation." He dropped it back onto the table as though it were contaminated. "Is that what you think this is? That I exploited you?" His face flushed with a rage that made him look both younger and uglier. The boy who once shouted at me because I would not buy him a bicycle. The man who now shouted because I would not stay quiet. I told him calmly that I only wanted to know my rights, that there was no harm in information, that asking questions was not betrayal. But he leaned closer, his hands on the back of the chair, and hissed, "You're going to ruin everything. Do you understand that? If you start pushing this, if you make this ugly, they'll think you're confused. They'll think you're sick. They'll put you somewhere you don't want to be. Is that what you want? To end up in some home?" He said it like a threat, not a warning. And for a moment my heart froze, because I knew he had the power to try, to twist stories, to present me as fragile, unstable, a woman whose words could not be trusted. But then something inside me broke free. I looked at him, really looked, and I saw not a protector, not a son, but a man cornered by his own choices, a man so desperate to maintain his image that he would trample even the mother who gave him everything. And instead of fear, I felt a strange calm wash over me, a clarity so sharp it cut through his anger like glass. "You can't behead someone twice," I said softly. He blinked, confused, his anger faltering. "You already took the house. You already took what was mine. You can't kill me again. I'm still here for the first time in years." He had no answer. He left with the same heavy steps he had arrived with, the door slamming behind him, but the sound no longer echoed in me as it once would have. Instead, I felt the stillness of the room wrap around me, not as suffocation, but as space, as breathing room, as possibility. I knew then that confrontation was no longer something to fear. It was inevitable, and perhaps it was even necessary. The days after that visit were filled with small retaliations, subtle punishments meant to remind me of my place. My daughter-in-law stopped calling entirely. No reminders about groceries or appointments, only silence that spoke louder than words. My grandson, during the next breakfast I attended, muttered that I was getting weird, a phrase he must have picked up from his father, and though no one corrected him, I did not let the words pierce me as before. I had begun to see each jab not as truth, but as proof that they were unsettled, that they sensed I was no longer obedient, no longer willing to play the role of the grateful relic. One evening, as I sat in the library again, Claire leaned across the table and whispered, "They'll try to scare you. They'll try to paint you as confused. Don't let them. Keep records. Write everything down. Dates, times, words. It all matters." I nodded, my pen already moving across the page, and for the first time I felt armed, not with weapons, not with youth, but with something sharper. Memory turned into record. Experience turned into evidence. It was not long after that when a letter arrived. Thick paper with the letterhead of a law office, words carefully chosen, but heavy with threat. They wanted to discuss my well-being. They wanted to clarify the status of assets. They wanted to ensure I was in a safe environment. Each phrase was wrapped in concern, but carried the smell of control, the stink of manipulation disguised as kindness. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, the evening sun falling across the words, and then I folded it neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it aside. They were not worried about my well-being. They were worried about losing what they had taken. Still, the pressure grew. A neighbor mentioned that my daughter-in-law had been asking questions, that she had spoken about me in tones that suggested fragility. That word again, as though being 82 automatically meant being broken. Another day, as I walked back from the bakery, I saw a car idling near the flat, my son inside, watching, not coming out, just watching, his face shadowed behind the windshield. I did not wave. I did not quicken my steps. I walked slowly, deliberately, turned my key in the lock and shut the door behind me. If he wanted to see me, he would see me on my terms. The past was pressing in, yes, heavier than before, but I was not crushed. I was being tested, measured, pushed, but with each attempt to silence me, my resolve deepened. The ember that had glowed when I first picked up that pamphlet had become a flame, not yet roaring, but steady, unyielding. They wanted me to believe I was powerless, but I had already tasted the truth, that even the smallest act of defiance, even the whisper of, "You can't, kill me twice," was enough to crack the mask of control they wore. So I continued to walk. I continued to write. I continued to ask questions. Each act was an escalation not only for them, but for me. Each step a reminder that I had already survived the worst of betrayals, and that nothing they threatened could erase the fact that I was still standing. They thought they could frighten me back into silence, but all they did was confirm what I already knew. That silence is the soil in which they grow their power, and I would no longer provide the ground. The moment of reclaiming did not come in a courtroom filled with spectators, nor in some cinematic outburst where I shouted decades of pain into their startled faces. It came in a quieter place, at a desk in the library, under the dim yellow light of a lamp that hummed faintly, with my notebook spread wide and my hands steady for the first time in years. Claire sat across from me, her silver-streaked hair tied back, her voice calm as she guided me line by line through the document she had drafted, each sentence a stone laid carefully in a wall that could not easily be pushed down. It was not revenge she was handing me, not even really justice, but something stronger, a language that could not be dismissed as hysteria or confusion, words that would stand where mine alone might not. The cease and desist was short, sharp, clinical in tone, but it carried the weight of my voice, stripped of tremor, free of apology. Reading it, I realized that I had never spoken so clearly to my son in my life. I signed it with a hand that no longer shook, and in that moment, I felt the echo of every other signature I had given away, every piece of paper I had once signed in trust or exhaustion or misguided hope, and I knew this signature was different. This one was not surrender but declaration. It said I was of sound mind, that I was not under duress, that any attempt to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment, that I had retained counsel, that I was no longer alone. I pressed the pen into the page so firmly that the letters carved themselves into the wood beneath, and when I lifted my hand, I almost laughed at how final it felt, how simple it was to reclaim even a fraction of what had been stolen. The letter went out the next morning. Sealed in an envelope, I dropped into the blue mouth of a postbox on the corner, my steps slow, but my heart beating with a rhythm I had not felt in years. As I walked away, I thought of the first house I had bought with my husband, the way he had carried me across the threshold, not as a gesture of tradition, but because the floorboards were still wet with varnish, and he did not want me to slip. I thought of how every wall we painted, every nail we hammered, had been a conversation between us, a claim to belonging, and how later that house became the one I signed away, not with love, but with pressure disguised as protection. Dropping that letter felt like stepping across a new threshold into a space I had made myself, varnished with my own defiance, carried only by my own legs. I did not wait long for a response. A week later, a man in a dark suit appeared at the cafe where I sometimes stopped after my walks, his briefcase gleaming, his shoes too polished for this town. He asked for me by name, his voice formal, careful, as though speaking to a witness on the stand. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, "I represent your son and daughter-in-law. They are deeply concerned about your well-being." I looked at him, at his soft hands, and his rehearsed expression, and I realized he had likely never spoken to a woman like me outside of depositions. I wiped the crumbs of my scone from my fingers, folded my napkin, and said, "Tell Adam and Lisa that I am not a pet they forgot to pick up. I am not property, and I do not need their concern." His mouth opened to reply, but I stood, slow but firm, and walked past him, the bell of the cafe door ringing behind me, louder than any gavel. That evening, I wrote a second letter, this one not drafted by Claire, not filtered through legal phrasing, but written in my own hand on lined paper I tore from a notebook. It was addressed to my daughter-in-law, only 3 sentences long. "I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I am not angry, but I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I finally started mine." I sealed it before I could second-guess myself and posted it the next morning with a stamp that bore the image of a bird in flight. When the letters had left my hands, when the lawyer's shoes no longer tapped at my door, when the silence from my family returned thicker than before, I thought I might feel lonely. But what I felt instead was something closer to peace. The quiet no longer pressed on me like suffocation. It spread around me like a quilt, heavy but warm, stitched together by choices I had made myself. I was not waiting for a call, not hoping for an apology, not rehearsing explanations I would never be given the chance to speak. For the first time, the absence of their voices did not feel like abandonment, but like space, room enough for me to breathe. And yet, even in that stillness, I knew the act was irreversible. I could not take the letters back, could not unsign the cease and desist, could not step again into the role they had built for me, even if I wanted to. I had crossed a line that no one else could see, but I felt it under my feet with every step. This was the moment of no return, and though I trembled with the weight of it, I did not falter. I had reclaimed not the house, not the furniture, not the quilt, or the wardrobe, or the photographs that might still be hidden in their attic, but something greater, the knowledge that I was not powerless, that I had chosen silence for too long, and that choosing to speak now made me stronger than all the years of endurance before. The climax of my story was not a confrontation in their kitchen, not a screaming match across a dining table, but the quiet, irrevocable act of putting my name on the page and sending it into the world as a shield. It was the realization that power does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the hush of a library, in the scratch of a pen, in the steady steps of a woman walking away from those who underestimated her. And as I sat by the window that night, the streetlights casting their dull glow across the parking lot, I felt something I had not felt in decades, the sense that my life belonged to me again. The ending was not triumphant in the way stories like to promise. There was no applause, no sudden reunion, no child rushing back with tears of regret. My son did not call. My grandson did not apologize. My daughter-in-law did not send an olive branch in the form of a polite card. The silence remained, and perhaps it always will. But something shifted inside me, something small but permanent, and it was enough. I began to notice that mornings did not feel so heavy anymore, that the act of rising from bed was not accompanied by dread, but by a quiet anticipation of what the day might bring, however ordinary. I brewed my tea, I opened the window, I listened to the faint hum of traffic, and instead of feeling exiled from life, I felt stitched back into it, thread by thread. I moved into a co-housing community for seniors, not a home, not an institution, but a place where people like me live side by side, each in our own small apartment, but with gardens we share and kitchens that fill with voices at supper. I signed the lease alone, my pen steady, and as I handed the paper back to the woman at the desk, I felt an odd surge of pride, the same pride I had once felt when I signed my very first lease as a young widow, determined to prove I could raise a son without crumbling. This time the signature was not about survival, it was about choice, and choice has a taste sweeter than anything I had known in years. In this new place, I am no longer invisible. People notice when I am absent from the table. They knock on my door if my curtains stay drawn too long. Not out of control, but out of kindness, the kind that does not suffocate. I walk each morning past a small bakery where the staff greet me by name, and though I still walk slowly, I walk steadily, and no one mocks me for it. Sometimes children from the neighborhood wave as they pass, and I wave back, and I think of my grandson, of the boy he still is, and of the man he might become. And I wonder if one day he will remember the stories I told him, not with ridicule, but with longing. I wrote him a letter, not angry, not sharp, just clear. I told him that words matter, that cruelty stains longer than he imagines, that kindness is a choice, and that I hope when he is grown, he chooses it more often than his father did. I did not send blame with the letter, only hope, because to carry bitterness is to drink poison and expect another to fall ill. Whether he reads it, whether he understands, I cannot control, but I have spoken, and that is enough. The house I lost will never return to me. The quilt, the wardrobe, the marigolds in the garden will live only in memory, and sometimes that knowledge still stings like a fresh wound. Yet I no longer measure my worth by the things taken from me, but by the things I refuse to let die. My dignity, my voice, my ability to step forward even when mocked as slower than a corpse. I walk, and with each step I remind myself that survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of something quieter, something stronger. If another woman hears my voice, if another woman is told she is too old, too fragile, too much of a burden, I want her to know this. You are not finished. They may take your house. They may take your place at the table. They may try to take your voice. but they cannot take the truth of who you are unless you hand it to them willingly. Hold on to one ember, however small, and let it burn. Even slow steps can carry you into freedom. Even whispers can undo silence. And so I end here, not as a relic, not as a ghost, but as a woman who chose to remain visible to herself. The world does not have to applaud. The children do not have to return. The family does not have to understand. I know who I am, and I know what I survived, and that knowledge is enough to carry me through the rest of my days. My steps may be slow, but they are mine, and I walk them without apology,